Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Today, my darlings, I am bringing you more authentic Skinwalker stories. This one is from North Carolina 316, and he is sharing what he learned from his grandfather, who learned it from the Utes. How to keep Skinwalkers at bay. My grandfather learned from the Utes. I'll never forget the lessons passed along from my grandfather about how to avoid, protect, and defend yourself from skinwalkers when alone. Our family owns a large ranch in Utah, and we are often out in the middle of nowhere without a town for over 70 miles when we are running cattle. From the time we could read, our grandfather taught us lessons he learned directly from the Ute medicine tribe members about how to protect yourself and defend yourself from skinwalkers if necessary. He said the main thing was to never show fear. Even if you were out in the middle of the wilderness, you had to remain confident. Skinwalkers feed on fear. They use the night, the uncertainty of the wilderness, and the defenselessness of a man in the middle of nature with only a knife or a gun to their advantage. This sounds general, but how do you really not show fear in nature, even if alone? Here is how it's broken down. Number 1, always travel in pairs if you can. If you cannot, bring a dog. If you cannot, and I mean absolutely cannot, bring a dog, then you'll have to exert your dominance. Number 2, exerting your dominance. Camp version. The Utes used nature's methods to exert their dominance. First and foremost, they would encircle their camps with a ditch about 1 foot deep and about 10 inches wide. The bottom of the ditch would be covered with bark, then overlaid with small pebbles so it looked like it had a cement bottom. Then on the sides, 16-inch pieces of branch would be nailed into the sides to form walls on both. The tops of the pieces of branch were rubbed with a combination of sage and sap daily, and the trench, or the encirclement, was used as the latrine for the male members of the tribe. They would urinate in the trench all day so that the scent would be rife at all times. When mixed with the sage-sap combo on top, it sent a clear message to skinwalkers that this land was not to be penetrated. They did not stop here. They would collect sweat as much as they could and place it in wooden casks. The men and women who had generated enough sweat would come to the casks and empty out. The casks were then taken and strategically thrown on the tallest trees around the camp, stretching as far as a 1/4 mile out. Each night, the casks were poured on a different set of trees, starting with the farthest outside and working back inside. Finally, animal hearts were placed on pointed spikes alongside walking trails 10 feet up, so only birds could eat them. This practice ensured skinwalkers would never penetrate the actual radius of the camp. Obviously, this practice had its limits. The next part details with the out in the wilderness portion. Number 3, exerting your dominance, wild version. In the wild, one had to adapt, but the Utes still stressed the urine and, if possible, sage and sap mix encirclement, because warriors and hunters didn't often have enough sage or time to set up full encirclements every night. With bark, pebbles, branch pieces, sage, and sap, they would just focus on the encirclement It's very important to note this. My grandfather stressed this over and over again. It was imperative that you created the encirclement before you set up camp, and if at all possible, before sunset. All who could then urinate would, but the Utes took it a step further. They made sure to bring sacks of urine with them, made from elk lungs, and they would portion off a bit along with their own, night by night, to ensure that the encirclement was well protected. To this day, my brothers and I do the same, but with gas tanks. They would also have a bag filled with animal hearts and lay about 2 to 4 on pikes outside the encirclement every camp. Finally, if they could bring a few small casks of sweat, they would. But in its place, they would often bring a gelled mix of sap and sweat and paint them on the tallest trees near the camp. The one other very important thing that they did when they were on their own was to create an abnormally large fire. This would usually be done at the front of a rock face to minimize the chance of a fire. The word my grandfather used to describe this was a 5-foot-high teepee. The larger-than-life fire will act as a deterrent when combined with urine and animal hearts. Number 4, exerting your dominance. General tips that apply to all situations. No matter if you are alone or in a group, always create the encirclement. Bring extra urine if you can. Build the full encirclement if you can. Think, if you want to send the message to all surrounding nature that you are the biggest badass predator around, this is how you do it. Obviously, we live in a day and age where the animal heart aspect is very difficult to procure, but that was an extra precaution anyway. Sweat. If you can get a bottle, bring it. If not, focus on the encirclement. Outside of that, there are other things one or many can do to keep skinwalkers at bay. 1. Regulated and directed hard breathing. The Utes would do a 4-second count and 4-second out breathing ceremony upon setting up camp and just before bed. The regulated breaths show that you have the ability to change your breathing and do so forcefully, something that no other animal has the ability to do. 2. Screaming 3 times as loud as possible. The Utes would do this just before bedtime and would always strategically place their camp in an area that would echo to send the message to skinwalkers the world over that they were not afraid. 3. Wear animal skins. This would seem obvious for Native Americans, and it was. But the Utes swore that the more skin they wore, even on the hottest days, the more protected they were. When the heat was unbearable, they would wear necklaces of deer and elk horn. They believed that to wear animal skins, even as necessary covering in the wild, was to send a message to the skinwalker that you were not afraid of dead animals. This is the first part of the knowledge passed on by my grandfather. I will continue to post the other parts in the coming weeks. I've never felt the need to share this with anyone until this virus hit. Now I feel like it's the right time, in case the knowledge is lost forever. Regarding my grandfather, the reason the Utes gave him this insider knowledge is that they have not shared with any white man before or after him, is because he found a hoard of Jesuit gold and silver and offered them a significant amount of his find for information on other possible Jesuit missions in Utah. This conversation took a different turn when my father revealed to them an experience he had with a skinwalker more than half a century ago. How to spot a skinwalker, their traits, and how to weaken them. one of many lessons my grandfather learned from the Utes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for your inquiries, questions, and responses to my last post. Many have asked that I continue these posts, and that is what I have always planned to do. I just didn't want to release them all at once. In today's discussion, I want to talk about the second most important lesson my grandfather learned from the Utes in relation to the Skinwalkers: how to spot one. If you can spot a Skinwalker in the daytime, you can ward them off much easier through methods discussed below. And if you are equipped with the right tools and skilled people, you can catch one alive. How to spot a Skinwalker. My grandfather started by revealing this truth. Skinwalkers most often appear as deer. If not a deer, then a coyote. It is only the most skilled Skinwalkers that can shift to wolf. More on that later. He said to take note of this when walking through the desert. If you ever see a deer, coyote, or other animal following you who clearly doesn't think of you as prey, it's highly likely they are a Skinwalker. Skinwalkers always follow from the high ground when possible. If an animal, especially a non-predatory one, is following you from a high point, it's likely a Skinwalker. The body shift. If you see an animal and the body doesn't follow the movements of the animal properly, it's a Skinwalker. The most obvious example is the countless stories about the deer who turned around, but their legs stayed behind. Often, unless they are at the highest level in the Skinwalker clan, early Skinwalkers will reveal themselves through clumsy shifts. The above are some obvious examples of how to spot a Skinwalker. Below you will see a list of traits known only to the Utes, and how the Utes used those traits of Skinwalkers to their advantage. Skinwalker traits according to the Utes. Much like a fish can only really live in the river and come up for air for a few seconds, the Skinwalker must remain in the desert to thrive. When the Skinwalker enters a forest, his life force diminishes by the step. If you see a Skinwalker and he's pursuing, look for the nearest forest to hide in its darkest shade. Skinwalkers are most visible in the desert. If you make eye contact with them or face them forward, you will likely see their eyes glow yellow, day or night. It is in the desert that the Skinwalker is both most powerful and most vulnerable. The desert during the day is the best place to catch or kill a Skinwalker. When their eyes glow, Skinwalkers are at their weakest because they are using all of their available energy to broadcast fear to potential predators. The best time to strike a Skinwalker is in the middle of the day in the desert when making eye contact. Skinwalkers are afraid to hear your name. If you call your given name out loud, Skinwalkers are forced to wait until the vocal resonance dissipates, and this can take hours. Skinwalkers have no names because they are considered themselves part of the shift or the ability to turn into any animal at will. Skinwalkers typically live in caves where man cannot reach, or on the tops of mesas. Skinwalkers, while being able to shift, must assume their human form during rest. They are still vulnerable to human patterns of existence, so they seek out places of rest that are seemingly unattainable to humans. The Utes would use this to their advantage and climb nearby cliffs to catch or kill Skinwalkers when they would least expect it. Note, Skinwalkers when sleeping are at their most powerful. In this state of rest, the strength to shift circulates throughout their body over and over again. If they are disturbed during rest, they are at their strongest and can kill in an instant. My grandfather told the story of a particularly nasty group of two skinwalkers who killed several children in a Ute village. A group of brave warriors tracked them to a set of cliffs where there was a giant half-dome cave about 200 feet up. The bravest warriors of the Ute tribe in the region snuck up the cliff, and when they reached the half-dome cave, they opened fire on the two skinwalkers. The skinwalkers were not to be deterred and instantly killed 3 warriors with their bare hands. The remaining Ute warriors kept firing, and finally the skinwalkers lunged towards the edge of the cliff, telling the warriors that they would come back for them another day. The skinwalkers ran to the edge of the cliff and jumped, but the Utes were already 2 steps ahead. For weeks they had been bringing in dry brush to the valley below the cave, and by the time the skinwalkers jumped, nearly 3 acres of deadfall was piled strategically throughout the valley, trees to look natural. The minute the skinwalkers left the cliff, the Utes below lit the pitch-covered deadfall, and when the skinwalkers landed, they were quickly trapped in a giant raging bonfire. The skinwalkers howled so loudly that it was said the wind whistled like wolves in that valley for another 50 years. Skinwalkers sloppily shed fur, and you can use it to summon them. When skinwalkers turn back, it's just as ugly as when they turn. Instead of cleanly shifting back into human form, skinwalkers often leave behind chunks of fur, sometimes up to 6 inches long and 2 inches wide, called bent skin. If you find bent skin, you can lure a skinwalker by blowing on the chunk of fur into a fire. The skinwalker will instantly follow the scent of your fire without question, instinctively. The Utes would use this method whenever they could, but it was very rare to find bent skin without actively knowing the footsteps of a skinwalker. The white wind, that is the expression the Utes used to describe the effects of speaking into quartz rocks to a skinwalker. Skinwalkers are greatly weakened by the voice vibrations of a quartz rock. Medicine men would carry them with them, giant quartz rocks, and set them upon a cliff to send out warnings to all nearby skinwalkers never to come near their camp. This could only be done when the evidence of the skinwalker in the immediate area of the camp could be found. It could not be used as a blanket method to ward off what would be attacker skinwalkers. The Utes thought that quartz resonated with souls, and that if spoken to with proper countenance from a medicine man or warrior, that the quartz rock could speak directly to the soul of a person or animal. There was one story about a particularly aggressive skinwalker who chose to stand outside the camp in elk form to intimidate the tribe. An elderly medicine man walked to a nearby rock face, put a giant quartz stone on top, and sang the name of the most recent victims to the skinwalkers over and over again. Within a matter of hours, the elk began to violently kick, turning from human to elk and back again, until it finally started taking the shape of the victims who it killed. The medicine man then commanded the skinwalker to turn back to its evil elk form and jump off a cliff to its final death. The next morning, the tribe woke up and found the skinwalker, in human form, split in half over a pointed stump. If you can find a skinwalker trail, usually characterized by animal footprints with unusual spacing and variations, example, deer hoof prints that all of a sudden emerge into 10-foot gaps, you can weaken a skinwalker greatly by putting fish remains in its prints. Animals from the water are highly poisonous to skinwalkers, in the spiritual sense because they represent water, the killer of the desert. The scent of the fish or other water animal will approach the heel of the skinwalker and cause him to weaken the more he walks. Warriors who found skinwalker trails would alert the tribe, and they would spend days fishing our local rivers and then preparing the remains to be used against the skinwalkers. The Utes would then follow the footprints for miles, leaving fish rot in each skinwalker indentation and pouring a mixture of water and fish oil near any pissing sites. Sometimes, if they followed the skinwalker closely enough, they would find it wandering half dead in the desert and then kill it or capture it. It is important to note that the use of fish in weakening a skinwalker can only be used when following it. It has to do with the skinwalker's sense of smell. They smell for miles both forwards and backwards, and the fish stench, in order to exact harm, must subtly come from behind. Otherwise, it will be detected and avoided ASAP. So in summary, one cannot catch a fish posted at their campsite and expect to ward off a skinwalker for good. One has to use the fish scent carefully to eventually send the skinwalker into ruin. Skinwalker ritual sites. Skinwalkers have religious sites all across the southwestern desert where they congregate from time to time. No one knows how often, but they know it happens. These religious gatherings usually take place at the top of mesas or in secret caves only accessible by skinwalkers. At these gatherings, the most diabolical happenings occur. Innocent captives are eaten alive for sport. Children are sacrificed. Humans are forced to fight to the death. And abducted women are forced to bear every depraved sex act ever conceived, all for the skinwalkers' entertainment. The Utes told the story of the operator of a Spanish mine who stumbled upon a viewing of such a ritual. The Spaniard had come to them to trade for supplies and had told them he knew of a skinwalker religious festival coming up that he wanted to sneak into, view it from afar. The Utes pleaded with him not to go and to head back to his homeland for his own safety and the safety of his men. The Spaniard was far too stubborn to listen to a mere native and snuck into a viewing of the ritual. Weeks later, they ran into the same Spaniard. He had aged at least 30 years. His hair was lightning white, and his skin had been charred by fire. The Utes gave him some water. He tried to speak, but each time he did, his whole body trembled. Upon trying to speak for a third time, sweat poured out all over his body. But it was not the kind of sweat that would soak on a warrior's back after a battle. It was blood coming out of his pores because sweat had given up. The Spaniard died seconds later, unable to communicate what ungodly things he had seen at the Skinwalker ritual. He didn't have to communicate. The Utes knew. Skinwalker ritual sites. The Ute responds. 3 generations before the Spaniard died from sheer panic and fear over the Skinwalker ritual, the Utes had their own tragic experience with it. 4 women, including 2 of the wives of the chief, had disappeared within a month. Through dreams, the 2 wives of the chief had reached out to the medicine man to let them know that they were being held captive in a giant room underneath a mesa. The medicine man and the chief assembled all the warriors in the tribe, approached the mesa, which was over 100 miles away. When they approached the mesa, they saw a sea of bones, which became more pronounced with each step. What used to be dried and withered animal ribs soon became human hips, skulls, and spines. The plants were dead for nearly half a mile in every direction. The medicine man and the warriors came up with a plan. The warriors would distract the Skinwalkers, while the medicine man and his team would build a giant lightning rod on top of the mesa. The warriors and the medicine men went their separate ways and carried out the plan. When the warriors found the cave beneath the mesa, they formed a perimeter around it and waited in the bushes until its rightful king returned. When the Skinwalkers came out of the brush and into the cave, they opened fire from all sides, everywhere, nearly painting the mesa with arrows before the arrow fire could finish. The medicine man at the top of the mesa grabbed a quartz stone and directed lightning to hit his 4-story tall quartz tower. The lightning hit the tower with such a force that the mesa cracked in half and covered half of the tribe in rubble. It is said that the Skinwalkers came out roasting alive, with smoke pouring out of their eyes, ears, and mouth, covered in charred black skin. The captured native women came out soon after, unscathed, with only a few cuts and bruises on them. The warriors yelled for the medicine man to come down, that they had been victorious. The medicine man then yelled back, "No victory until dust." The medicine man proceeded to conduct 50 more strikes of lightning on the mesa. With each strike it crumbled, until finally it was reduced to a small sandhill. The medicine man was barely able to walk, so succumbed with forcing the lightning strikes, when a warrior approached him and said, "Look." The medicine man looked and saw a beautiful white bird landing on a small sandhill that used to be the mesa. The medicine man then grabbed the bird and snapped its neck. The bird turned into a muscular human. The medicine man said, "Let's find his sandhill." The medicine man, who was named Fist of Lightning and Death, went on to destroy 4 mesas and 3 giant caves. But his words only chased the wind of the Skinwalkers. Lessons from my grandfather. The Utes do not trust the Navajo, and here's why. I thought I should post this because it's very important to distinguish the difference between what the Utes thought of the Skinwalkers versus the Navajo. A user a few posts back just asked, why is it that the Navajo don't like talking about Skinwalkers? There are several reasons provided, but to the Utes, there's one clear reason. The Navajo and Skinwalkers are too often indistinguishable. There is an old Ute saying, if you meet a Navajo, you must ask if you are meeting an elk, a coyote, a wolf, or all of them at once. According to the Utes, the reason so many Navajo are found to be Skinwalkers is because the Navajo made a deal with the Skinwalkers soon after the tribe came up to the surface. Whether for protection or power, the Utes are certain that the Navajo made a deal with them. The deal the Navajo made is that they would give a certain number of their bravest warriors to the Skinwalkers, so they could use their powers for the good of the Navajo tribe, and that in return, the Skinwalkers would leave their tribe relatively alone. The Skinwalkers were so brazen in their offer that they would not guarantee that they would leave the Navajo alone. They just assured them they would take much less of their people. The Navajo Skinwalkers were allowed to pass between the world of the Skinwalkers and the tribe. They used their shape-shifting skills to outwit the Spanish settlers and incite the riots in the minds that would eventually cause them to leave. They also used these skills to keep their rival tribes, like the Utes, at bay. To protect themselves from the Navajo, the Utes sent their top medicine man to the location from which all southwestern tribes came back to the surface after the Great Cataclysm. He left a message to the spirits, letting them know that the Navajo had made a deal with the Skinwalkers, and that they will not be allowed to find refuge again unless the Ute tribe is full and healthy. The spirits agreed and gave the medicine man a token of their understanding, a gemstone that glowed in all hours of day and night. The medicine man took this stone to the Navajo and informed him of his agreement with the spirits. The Navajo agreed never to use their skinwalkers against the Utes or to make any attempt to destroy them. But there was a schism in the Navajo tribe that exists to this very day. There are those who despise the skinwalkers and wish to rid them entirely from the Navajo tribe. And there are those, mainly elders now, who want to keep the balance between the Navajo and the Skinwalkers. The cult of the Navajo Skinwalkers, which used to be known to the whole tribe, now exists in small groups to prevent an uprising. This is the state of the Navajo revealed to my grandfather in the 1940s. I'm sure it's much worse now with the resistance to Skinwalkers. Well, my darlings, there is another point of view. It does seem we've seen this is the second nation outside of the Dene who have an opinion and are actively protecting themselves from Skinwalkers. This was in the comment of the last video by Desi Chicky 101. Because the main use at the time was to spy on settlers who have come from wherever. My father has told me that the main reason for Skinwalkers was to spy and possibly kill those that were intruding on certain lands. Until the Navajo version of Skinwalkers is now being abused by those who continue to use it for bad purposes. One of the ways you could possibly find someone who is a Skinwalker is when they use and wear a lot of jewelry, such as turquoise, that is in the rings, necklaces, bracelets, etc. I remember one time when I was at Shiprock Flea Market, I was looking among the tables and noticed a man who was wearing a lot of jewelry. My mom noticed it as well and told me to let's go because of how much jewelry the man was wearing. I had a bad feeling as well. And we held on to my arrowhead, then prayed for protection for myself and my family. And someone asked why they wear a lot of jewelry, the Skinwalkers. And the answer was they are thieves and grave robbers. The jewelry they have, they've stolen from the dead or from others. And apparently the Dene do not buy jewelry at pawn shops. So quoth this raven. So I hope this is of interest to you. It was very much interesting to me. I did know that Skinwalkers were more accepted by the Dene in earlier times. And this kind of explains that a little bit more. It kind of opens that up a bit more. That the Skinwalkers who are Dene have some sort of alliance with a demon sort of race. To put it in Western terms, which is odd because this is Western, but Western European terms, I suppose. So there's long-standing arguments between the nations. I would think you guys are all familiar with Skinwalker Ranch, though I haven't done a video on it. I don't think I have anyway. A very interesting area where strange things of all sorts happen. Dimensional UFOs, everything. It got its name from a war between, I believe it was the Utes and the Navajo. At the time, the Navajo were using skinwalkers as spies, as mentioned. The creation of the skinwalkers in this area for use in this war is supposedly what cursed the land. I'm just assuming you all know about it. If not, Swamp Dweller did a video about it not too long ago if you want to check out his video on that. It's a fascinating story that is relatively close to me. Probably about 2 to 3 hours away. In America, that's pretty close, especially out in rural areas. Anyway, I thought you'd find that interesting. Thank you all for joining me. I hope you found this interesting. I certainly did. I absolutely adore this sort of thing, as you all know. If you have any stories of skinwalkers or legends or anything of that sort, please feel free to share them on my subreddit, Madam Raven's Darlings, so that I can share them on here, because I just absolutely love this stuff. I do. Thank you all for visiting me, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and special thanks to Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams.